Uh, I've been told that the reading is being taped, and if it's not pretentious to dedicate a tape, I would like to do what I've done, I think, every time in the last 2 or 3 years that I've made a reading and read that poem and it was being taped, and dedicate the tape to everybody connected with the University of Buffalo or the vicinity who's got into trouble with draft resistance, because I feel immensely grateful to them, and at the moment, tap wood, I'm not in trouble that way myself, having busted out of the Navy some years ago, but I honor what they're doing, and I think it takes an immense amount of courage, especially with the kind of conditions that we have at the moment, to do that kind of thing. And I think these are the guardians of what civilization we have left. But this next poem that I want to read is not about anyone as young as that. I was living, at the time I wrote it, in the Lower East Side in New York, and very close to a number of Hasidic and other kinds of Orthodox Jewish sects, and aware of both the violence of the neighborhood and of the tradition of violence and of that kind of endurance of it that was exemplified all around me, and I think that was one of the things the poem came out of. It's called The Students of Justice. All night I hear the hammers of the blind men in the next building repairing their broken doors. When it is silent, it is that they are gone, before the sun lights the way for the young thieves. All day the blind neighbors are at their lesson, coloring a rough book, oh, a long story. And under their white hair they keep forgetting. It tells of gorges hung with high caves and little rotting flags, and through the passes caravans of bugs bearing away our blood in pieces. What can be done? What can be done? They take their hammers to the lesson. The last words, so they promise me, will be thank you, and they will know why. And that night they will be allowed to move. Every day they leave me their keys, which they never use. I want to read another translation before I go on to the most recent book of poems. Maybe a couple of translations. One of them is I've been doing some free translations from an Urdu poet with the help of somebody who knows Urdu, not because I know it. Ghalib, who was a 19th century very great poet, and he wrote in a form which again I've abandoned because it's meaningless in English. It's a kind of a interrelated series of couplets. The point of it seems to me like the point of a lot of Welsh poetry is that a form is a heuristic invention. It's something that leads to discovery, and it's possible when the circumstances, including the language, fall away, that the discovery may remain even though the form that led to it or helped to lead to it is no longer there. I hope some of the discoveries came across in the translation, although the form didn't. Most of these are love poems, but one of the things about the form was that as long as the form was kept, the subject could jump as it liked, so that you get this kind of strange associative form coming out of an apparently extremely rigid convention, which is, very different from, the 18th century poetry in English, for example. I am not a flower of song, nor any of the bright shuttles of music. I am the sound of my own breaking. You think about how your hair looks. I think of the ends of things. We think we know our own minds, but our hearts are children. Now that you have appeared to me, I bow. May you be blessed. You look after the wretched. No wonder you came looking for me. there are several love poems, and some of them are kind of satiric and ironic, like this one. Everybody looking, but it makes no difference. I just sit still and let them point. Pawn my rags and prayer rug for wine. A long time since it was offered at a table. If fate permitted, I would say to the earth, miser, what did you do with all those priceless things? She must have picked up this habit from somebody else, giving kisses now before she's asked. But determination is something else. She's not spiteful. She's kept many promises out of sheer forgetfulness. There are a couple of very different love poems to read along between these two books of my own. And this is another real jump. I want to read two poems by a Spanish poet who died in 1951. They're rather alike. He I think was one of the great poets of the 20th century. He's not very well known yet. Pedro Salinas. I think it won't be very long before he is. And almost all the poems he wrote were love poems. I mean, this was the real theme of his life. And some of them are very metaphysical and some of them are not. These two are rather, as I said, rather alike. First one's called Her Absence. You're not here. What I see of you, a body, is a shadow, a trick. Your soul has gone where you yourself will be tomorrow. Still this afternoon offers me false hostages, aimless smiles, idle gestures, a love distracted. You wanted to go, and it took you where you wanted to be, far from here, where you are, saying to me, here I am with you, look, and you point to your absence. And the other one's called Further Question. Why do I ask where you are if I'm not blind and you're not absent? If I see you go and come, you, your tall body ending in a voice, as a flame ends in smoke, in the air, untouchable, and I ask you, yes, and I ask you what you're made of and whose you are, and you open your arms and show me the tall image of yourself and say it's mine, and I go on asking forever. I want to go back from translations to the last published book of poems called The Lice, and then break it again and then go on to end with some more recent poems. Is a poem which I'll read. I think I've read it before, and I hope I haven't read it before in Buffalo. But I want to read it because of those two prose pieces that I read, and to make a kind of link forward with some other things that I want to read afterwards. It's a poem which is sort of again quite a link with all of the prose pieces in its form. It's called The Last One. Well, they'd made up their minds to be everywhere, because why not? Everywhere was theirs because they thought so. They with two leaves, they whom the birds despise. In the middle of stones, they made up their minds. They started to cut. Well, they cut everything because why not? Everything was theirs because they thought so. It fell into its shadows and they took both away, some to have, some for burning. Well, cutting everything, they came to the water, They came to the end of the day. There was one left standing. They would cut it tomorrow. They went away. The night gathered in the last branches. The shadow of the night gathered in the shadow on the water. The night and the shadow put on the same head, and it said, "Now." Well, in the morning they cut the last one. Like the others, the last one fell into its shadow. It fell into its shadow on the water. They took it away. Its shadow stayed on the water. Well, they shrugged. They started trying to get the shadow away. They cut right to the ground. The shadow stayed whole. They laid boards on it. The shadow came out on top. They shone lights on it. The shadow got blacker and clearer. They exploded the water. The shadow rocked. They built a huge fire on the roots. They sent up black smoke between the shadow and the sun. The new shadow flowed without changing the old one. They shrugged. They went away to get stones. They came back. The shadow was growing. They started setting up stones. It was growing. They looked the other way. It went on growing. They decided they would make a stone out of it. They took stones to the water. They poured them into the shadow. They poured them in. They poured them in. The stones vanished. The shadow was not filled. It went on growing. That was one day. The next day was just the same. It went on growing. They did all the same things. It was just the same. They decided to take its water from under it. They took away water. They took it away. The water went down. The shadow stayed where it was before. It went on growing. It grew onto the land. They started to scrape the shadow with machines. When it touched the machines, it stayed on them. They started to beat the shadow with sticks. Where it touched the sticks, it stayed on them. They started to beat the shadow with hands. Where it touched the hands, it stayed on them. That was another day. Well, the next day started about the same. It went on growing. They pushed lights into the shadow. Where the shadow got onto them, they went out. They began to stomp on the edge. It got their feet. And when it got their feet, they fell down. It got into eyes. The eyes went blind. The ones that fell down, it grew over, and they vanished. The ones that went blind and walked into it vanished. The ones that could see and stood still, it swallowed their shadows. Then it swallowed them too, and they vanished. Well, the others ran. The ones that were left went away to live, if it would let them. They went as far as they could, the lucky ones with their shadows. What? I don't want to make any explanations at all, but to jump to two very different kinds of poems, which are really about, I suppose they're about the same thing, but they're about the same thing in an opposite direction. They're also very, very short poems. One's a very personal one, and first person singular, and the other's first person plural. First is called The Dream Again. I take the road that bears leaves in the mountains. I grow hard to see, then I vanish entirely. On the peaks it is summer. And the other one, which is the real opposite to the one I read, is called How We Are Spared. At midsummer before dawn, an orange light returns to the mountains like a great weight, and the small birds cry out and bear it up. There are several poems that go along with that, and I want to read them. I mean, in that book there are, and they're all fairly short poems. I want to read them together. And they vary from personal poems to poems written out of absolute despair at the what was going on in the historic context we're living in. There are I want to read first a couple of personal ones. One is called The Dry Stone Mason, and I should say that dry stone masonry is masonry without mortar, and we're getting far enough away from it that it's necessary to explain the fact that it's obviously one of the endless number of dying arts that are all around us. I don't mean this book to sound despondent. The mason is dead, the gentle drunk, master of dry walls. What he made of his years crosses the slopes without wavering, upright but nameless, ignorant in the new winter, rubbed by running sheep. But the age of mortar has come to him. Bottles are waiting like fallen shrines under different trees in the rain. And stones drip where his hands left them, leaning slightly inwards. His thirst is past. As he had no wife, the neighbors found where he kept his suit. A man with no family, they sat with him. When he was carried through them, they stood by their own dead, and they have buried him among the graves of the stones. The related one, in a way, that I wanted to read is called For the Anniversary of My Death. And then I want to read one more from that book. This is For the Anniversary of My Death. Every year, without knowing it, I have passed the day when the last fires will wave to me, and the silence will set out, tireless traveler, like the beam of a lightless star. Then I will no longer find myself in life as in a strange garment, surprised at the earth and the love of one woman and the shamelessness of men, as today writing after 3 days of rain, hearing the wrens sing and the falling cease, and bowing, not knowing to what. There are a couple of poems, well, there's several poems at the end of that book in which the second person plural is very present, and in a kind of in its historic in a historic sense. And I want to read one of them, and one of the most despairing of them. The other one is not even despairing; it's simply completely out. In some sense, that writing or any symbolic form of expression allows, it's outside the experience. Obviously, the person who writes it isn't. This one is in no sense outside it. It's called, although it's an attempt to escape it, it's called Avoiding News by the River. And it wasn't then, when the poem was written in I think 64 or 5, and it certainly isn't now necessary to explain at any given day what the news might have been. As the stars hide in the light before daybreak, reed warblers hunt along the narrow stream. Trout rise to their shadows. Milky light flows through the branches, fills with blood. Men will be waking. In an hour it will be summer. I dreamed that the heavens were eating the earth. Waking, it is not so, not the heavens. I am not ashamed of the wren's murders, or the badger's dinners, on which all worldly good depends. If I were not human, I would not be ashamed of anything. The other one, which really needs no explanation at all, unless every day, is called The Asians Dying. When the forests have been destroyed, their darkness remains. The ash, the great walker, follows the possessors forever. Nothing they will come to is real, nor for long. Over the watercourses, like ducks in the time of the ducks, the ghosts of the villages trail in the sky, making a new twilight. Rain falls into the open eyes of the dead again with its pointless sound. When the moon finds them, they are the color of everything. The nights disappear like bruises, but nothing is healed. The dead go away like bruises. The blood vanishes into the poisoned farmlands. Pain, the horizon, remains. Overhead the seasons rock. They are paper bells, calling to nothing living. The possessors move everywhere, under death their star. Like columns of smoke, they advance into the shadows. Like thin flames with no light, they with no past, and fire their only future. All kinds of hazards up here. I want to read. Make sure I get the right notebook. Yeah. I want to read a piece of prose between that and the next poems. This was, I said the poems are going in a roughly chronological order, and the prose is very recent and is deliberately being jumped back through them to show that maybe some things have been coming together all along and I didn't know it. This piece of prose is called The Conqueror. About a little over a page long. It has not always been like this, he said. At one time, my performance did not call up vibrations out of the great fault. On the other hand, I was not remembered for so long. Here I thought of the sound of the stadium as I had approached it, when the sport had already been going on for heaven knows how long. The air had been oppressive around the walls like a held breath, and I had been unable to tell whether the shrieking that rose from inside was an expression of the excitement and pleasure of the spectators, or the monosyllable of some ultimate terror. This is by no means the first time it has happened, he went on, but so far no one has ever been so hypocritical as to destroy my statue or change my name on the boulevards, and they will not do so this time, never fear. Though even if they did, it would not make much difference in the long run. As it is, look at the size of my name on the posters. Each time I take the field, I am their idol. What they would all like to be loved by, to know. How they smile on the little boys who are happy to admit it. Then the anthem is sung, the adversary comes forward, all flutes, flowers, little songs. I draw my sword, the match begins. I used to have to send back reports. Everything took longer, except the game itself. After the beginning, one forgets the spectators. One forgets time. One plays as well as one can, aware for the moment of nothing else. One wins and turns in one's bloody boots to see that the spectators have changed. Everything about them looks different. They are on their feet, shrieking, not in admiration, but in disgust. They cry now for vengeance. They grieve over what I have done to please them. If only I were alive, they say, so that I might be punished. Imagine, pretending that I am not alive. I said, in my own part of the stadium, it is not so much the killing they object to as the pleasure it gives. They won't escape that either, he said, merely by building larger stadiums with worse acoustics as they're doing at present. The only way for anyone to get home is to go with the crowd. Those who leave before the show is over, either singly or by twos and threes, though the party were to include the president himself, are met at the gate, where they are covered with flowers, presented with flutes, and given little songs to memorize. There's one I want to read with that, a piece of prose, and before I go on to the last group of poems. It's called Greeting to be Addressed to the Dead on the Morning of Their 5th Year. It is your day, patient one. We would hardly know it was you under the rags. Pieces from last year, a belt from the year before, remnants of boots from the year before that, even some buttons and rusted fastenings that must hark back to the ill-fitting narrative you were buried in. Everything that we have brought you year by year, please note, has been true to what you might have been, insofar as we have been able to imagine that. Look, we have brought you your new story. The hat with the bright feathers was a gift from the King of the Winds, a token of esteem and an invitation to meet and to be loved by his daughter, the most beautiful princess in the empire. You are on your way to his domains. The whole of the night is your guard. The blind are drawn up along your road. As you pass each one, he sees the sunrise. These flowers now are to give to her when you see her, and these are to give to her the day after. And once again, this ribbon which we wrap around you recounts the days of your happiness and of our hope. You that were poor, you that were ignorant, you that were graceless and ungifted and frightened and cold of heart. This year you will find us again in your story, in great need. Remember us. Bless us out of your superabundance. Wake us with hope. See, we leave you every colored thing we have brought with us, and turn back in our black garments to what we have inherited and call the truth, to history, the form of despair reserved for the living. I want to go on to newer poems, which I hope are rather different in some ways from what I've been reading, and then end with another bit of prose. Most of these poems are from an unpublished, a book to appear next year, which will be called The Carrier of Ladders. Some of them I think they're quite different from the poems in the Lice, but I'm not an authority. I'm not from the right vantage point to know about that. This is a poem which is addressed to someone else, and it kind of makes a dramatic situation out of something which is really a private one. But the occasion which was taken for it was the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Verdun, and actually I know someone who was at the Battle of Verdun and survived it. That's all one needs to know, except that there are a couple of allusions to French medieval epics in it. But that's not what the poem's about. The title of the poem is Edouard, and the echo of the Scottish ballad is also deliberate, about why does your brown se drip with blood. Edouard, shall we leave tomorrow for Verdun again? Shall we set out for the great days and never be the same? Never. Time is what is left. Shall we start this time in the spring, and they lead your cows out next week to sell at the fair, and the brambles learn to scribble over the first field? Edouard, shall we have gone when the leaves come out? But before the heat slows the grand marches. Days like those, the heights and the dying at thy right hand, sound a long horn. And here the bright handles will fog over. Things will break and stay broken in the keeping of women. The sheep get lost. The barns burn unconsoled in the darkness. Edouard, what would you have given not to go, sitting last night in by the fire again? But shall we be the same? Tomorrow night shall we not have gone, leaving the faces and nightingales? As you know, we will live. And what never comes back will be you and me.